and welcome to On the Line Perspectives on Partition, a series of conversations conceived by the Bloody Sunday Trust to mark one of the most significant events in modern Irish history, the partition of the island in 1921. I'm Paul McFadden, and throughout this series, I'm being joined by a range of people from across the community who are willing to share their thoughts on one of the truly seismic events in modern Irish history. All of us who have grown up on this island have been affected by partition, and many of us have very strong opinions about it. In this series, I'm hoping to explore people's experiences and views to find out whether any lessons may be learned. Today's guest grew up quite close to the border, but has spent most of her working life in Northern Ireland. She is the leadership consultant, a very active activist in the past, Fidelma Carolan. Fidelma, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
You're very welcome, Paul.
Partition, it's a huge issue, whether you're from the north or from the south. What has it actually meant for you in your life?
Well, when I was growing up, we were probably about 12 miles from the border as the crow flew. And we would have went over the border quite regularly. We would have went to Enniskillen to go shopping, and then we would have been, as kids, sitting on a blanket on top of the contraband as my mother drove back over the border with whatever she purchased, which is very harmless, I have to say. That anything she purchased was completely harmless, but electrical goods were always much cheaper over in the north. And we always would have talked about going down the north and up to Dublin, which is completely counterintuitive, but that's kind of the language we would have used. And also then, as kids, we went up to the swimming pool in Enniskillen, because Cavan, as a county, in the entire county, there was no swimming pool. So you either went to Monaghan or to Enniskillen. So I suppose going over and back the border kind of was the norm. And also I was into athletics and sport, so it would have went up, down the north running and stuff like that. But I suppose the border, you just kind of went through, as a kid in the back of the car. The army stopped you. They ask your parents where were you going, where were you coming from, and I had no real sense, I suppose, of it as it sounds bizarre, but as a teenager, I had no real sense of it as such a political entity. In fact, it was great, because once you went over the border, things were cheaper. So there was a kind of a benefit, it was it was a bit different. So there wasn't that sense of kind of political, kind of political kind of identity around the border for me. And even I remember my one time going over, and I must have been fairly young, but we went over the border, and the army, young fella, asked my mother where we were going. She said, "We're going up to Enniskillen. When are you coming back? We'll be back later on." And he said, "You wouldn't get us a couple of buns, would you? Because we've been on duty for the last 72 hours. And my mother said, "Yeah, of course." And when she got her license back, there was a fiver in the back of the license. And again, we weren't political, so my mother went and bought the buns. But I remember when she was on the way back down, she handed back the buns, and it was only afterwards. I remember talking to her when years later, when she kind of realised the significance of somebody seeing her give this brown paper bag, albeit of chocolate eclairs, to the army, and the potential connotations of that, which was completely outside our thinking at the time. And then when I came north to go to college, I got offered a place in Dublin City University to do communications, and I got offered media studies in English in Coleraine. And the reason I came to Coleraine was because it's really sporty. And the university had fantastic sports facilities, and DCU had just moved from being NIHE and had no sports facilities. So the only reason I went to Coleraine was predominantly for the sports and the athletics, and then once I got there, I actually did very little sport and got into student politics instead. But that was my original intention. Although I do tell the story about growing up as a young lesbian in Cavan and wanting to kind of get away from small town rural Ireland. And I could have went to London or Manchester or New York, to come out, but instead I went to Coleraine. So there you have it.
It's very different. Did you have any particular sense of difference?
It was strange, not at the time. I think looking back now, I would say, like, we had the Protestant church and the Catholic church. When I was growing up, I didn't even know there was different types of Protestants. It sounds bizarre. I just never, I just didn't know. And there was the Protestant hall. And I would have said growing up that I knew all the shops in the town that were owned by Protestants. And the only reason I could say that I must have known that was because of things that my parents said. And I wouldn't have never considered them sectarian or anything like that. but it was obviously they must have mentioned it, and I picked it up and absorbed it. And because I went to a Catholic school, Catholic youth club, in the parish hall, so I actually had very little opportunity to meet Protestants. So people presume that the kind of sectarian divide and kids don't mix in the north because of segregation in schools and that. In the south, I would say it's probably not that much difference. Obviously, there's a much smaller Protestant community, but I didn't really know any Protestants growing up. And then when I went to university, obviously, it was a complete melting pot because you had Erasmus students, you had young people from right through the north, you had people from the south as well, and then a lot of English students as well, in Coleraine who would have came through clearing. It was Coleraine was very popular for clearing. So I think that's really what I met and really got to know, people who identified as Protestants. And again, I never thought of myself as a Catholic at all. Obviously I was a Catholic, but never thought of myself as a Catholic because we obviously were in the majority. So in the north, suddenly I was a Catholic. Um, so that was kind of very, very new to me. But again, in university, you didn't pay much heed. You just got on with kind of being a student, and there was a good mix. It was really only when I got my first job. So my first job was in Lisburn Women's Centre. It was in the 90s. I was young, I was naive, but it was fantastic. I think the naivety was fantastic because most of the volunteers in the Women's Centre were Protestant, because Lisburn was predominantly Protestant town. Some of them were involved in the local Orange lodges. Very working class. Had a lot of really working class women come in. I came from a nice middle class background, so again that was really new to me, and I had the fantastic discussions. And because although I was Catholic, I wasn't from the north, so it wasn't that my people did anything to your people. I wasn't. I had really kind of free conversations with them, and I could ask the most stupid questions, and they felt, we developed a good enough rapport and trust where I could have really really good conversations about Garvaghey Road, which was around that time, around I suppose just the politics of the day, and it was really only been involved in the women's sector and working with Footprints Women's Centre and me in Lisburn, that I really got a really sense of difference and the political history and the lived experience of, say, Republican, women living in nationalist areas, working class nationalist areas, and women living in working class loyalist areas, and having those conversations and being involved and talking to women from those areas. That was really, I suppose, where I really learnt more about kind of lived history in Northern Ireland, which is disgraceful given how close I lived to the border all my life.
Could you have had such open, such candid discussions with those particular women had you come from the north? If you'd been, for example, a working class woman from Derry or from West Belfast?
I think it might have been more difficult because I guess there would have been that suspicion that my people might have had something to do with hurting their people. So again, coming from the south, it was almost like an alien. It was, and the irony is that it was only when my grandmother died, I really discovered that we had quite a Republican background. My grandfather and his brothers in the old IRA. My great uncle is buried with old IRA volunteer. Apparently, he got the whole military funeral in the early 1970s. And I had no sense really of that history growing up. And when I asked my father, how come, he says we just don't talk about that. So my father would have been Fianna Fáil background. My mother would have been staunch Fine Gael background. But again, that wasn't. I had no sense of that really growing up at all. So really in the north, ironically, I probably had closer links to by in terms of my great uncle and my grandfather to the old IRA than a lot of Catholic women they may have met ordinarily in the north. So.
There's quite an extraordinary kind of background. What about that lived experience you talked about? This series is discussing partition, and I'm just wondering what your observations were as that young woman coming from County Cavan into first Coleraine, then into Lisburn, and looking at the kind of society you found in those two, fairly different places. Certainly, I would have thought very different to Cavan.
Oh yeah, I think, the key thing for me was about the social deprivation. So I was working around adult education, and the need for the women's centres very much in those areas were about adult education. They were about getting women to kind of have conversations and dialogue as well. But so many women had lost out on education growing up. They had maybe have become pregnant. They had to go and work because families needed the money. There were so many reasons why women dropped out of education. And I think what I really got a real sense of was, I suppose, um, the challenges growing up in working class communities. And I think what I always would have said, when I talk to women who grew up in housing estates in Lisburn, and you talk to women who grew up in housing estates in Poleglass, they both had an equally crap time in terms of income, access to resources, um, ideas, even aspiration for third level education, because their parents didn't go, nobody's parents went. So I think in some ways the working class, certainly within working class areas, they had a lot more in common than they did, almost dividing them, obviously, apart from the political opinions.
Was a working class experience of a working class woman in Northern Ireland markedly different from the working class experience of women in the Republic, whether it be in urban or rural areas? Was it that much different?
I don't know, because growing up in a very small town, Cavan, and even when I was 19, I didn't really know any working class women. Not really, not anyone who would define themselves as working class. It was, I suppose, which sounds actually bizarre. And growing up, we would have went and I did work with local traveller women, and that was really interesting. That as a teenager, that was fascinating. And that was around literacy. I was involved in my local youth club, but I was, a very protected, nice middle class family who had the presumption was all we'd all go to university if we got the grades. Those kind of things. That was just our world. So I would say coming up north was really the first time I got exposed to working class. Even things like domestic violence. I didn't even know domestic violence existed as a teenager growing up. So I mean, it sounds pretty much an idealistic, apart from maybe struggling with my sexuality. I had a very lovely upbringing, I have to say. I think up here, coming north, I mean, it was it always I suppose surprised me how much people in the north were convinced that people in the south really cared about the north, because my experience of the south was people didn't really care about the north. And I remember having the conversation. My cousin came up. He actually went to the catering college in Portrush, and I remember having that conversation with him. And there was the presumption in the north that that people were fighting for the freedom of Ireland and the freedom of the north, and the free and the six counties, etc., etc. But actually, people in the south, my sense was they didn't really care about the north. As long as all that madness stayed up there, they didn't really care. Um, and when I would talk about some of the things in the north, Garvahi, and kind of like, like people thought I was mad that I was even living there. I mean, I got hijacked when I was delivering pizza, and I never told my parents. Actually, to this day, I've never told my parents, because they would have dragged me back over the border to the safety. Um, so when I would meet my friends, when I go down home and I talk about things I've met and discussions I was having, and I got involved in the Women's Coalition, when I stood for election for the Women's Coalition in the first, the early elections and stuff like that, people just thought it was fascinating, but they thought the North was just this. It was just madness, and as long as it was all over there, then we don't really care. So I think that's the thing about partition. When you're looking at partition now, I think there's still a presumption that people in the South care about the North, don't care what happens, and I'm not convinced that there's that solidarity in the South with people in the North at all. And I think,
How do you think, Fidelma, that women on the northern side of the border then view, as they look across the border at the south, do you think the woman, I imagine they had a different kind of view of it, but I'm interested in what you have to say about it. Did women in nationalist Republican areas have a different view of the Republic to those living in PUL communities?
yeah, possibly. I mean, I think that the South was always seen as that kind of, socially, very much more socially conservative, and the dominance of the Catholic Church. Obviously, there's still a very strong dominance up here in those communities as well, but the state was so dominated by the Catholic Church, in terms of the laws, or dominated everything, including kind of rights for LGBT people. So I think initially, I think the south would be seen as a bit of a backwater. I think overall by the north, there's a bit by northerners. I'm being very, very kind of, I suppose, generalist here,
Yeah.
but I think because of um the role of the church played in the state, I think that kind of was how the south was viewed by people in the north generally, um, and I'm not sure that women in the north who would have had maybe more freedom, but in terms of UK law, would have certainly maybe looked at the south as a bit of a backwater and be glad they were in the north. People in the north, the people in the south would look at the north and look at the NHS and think, well, isn't that great? But I'm not sure I'd want to trade. They'd want to be a really good deal before I trade that. Um, but certainly when I saw the south move in terms of LGBT rights so fast and ahead of the north, there's no doubt about it. I was jealous. I was delighted. I was so delighted. And I was amazed, and really, really proud of the activists and the people in the Republic who made that happen and had those conversations. And they very much, I think for me, what they did was they really showed the importance of conversations. And I think that's maybe what's missing in the kind of dialogue between the north and the south at the moment. I think there's not enough conversation between ordinary people. I mean, in the referendum in the south on marriage equality, people knocked every door, and they took the line, "I'm voting yes. Ask me why," rather than "You should vote yes. Here's why." Um, and that opened up. That was a very powerful for me. That opened up a conversation. I think what disappoints me about what's going on right now in the north is that there's not the understanding that there is a population here who identifies as unionist, and that there's not enough of a conversation going on to really, say, well, what could it be like for you to live in a 32 county Ireland and have and be respected as the minority, and be totally respected and feel totally able to hold your identity and be proud of your identity, and somebody else not say you can't. And I think because all the conversations that are going on, certainly at political level, in the political stage, it's that constant clash. It's that constant kind of like, for us, we're going to get one over on you. We're going to get, and this is a threat. So the border poll is a threat. It's such a threat. And I think it's as much almost a threat to Southerners as it is to Northerners. And it really disappoints me. It disappoints me the way that it's been held up. And as we're going to have a border poll, and then we're going to get 51%, and then we'll have you. Then you can do nothing about it. Instead of saying, actually, the only way we're going to win a border poll is if enough people on this island and enough people from all communities decide that, and it can agree that there's a future for us all on a shared island. And I don't think that work's been done at all. And I find it really disappointing.
Yeah, who do you blame for that situation? I mean, I asked the question because there hasn't been any great indication at leadership level within political unionism that they want to have that conversation. It may be different on the ground, and we've really, I think, I found out in this series of conversations that there's maybe more of an openness to that conversation than people might imagine. But who would you point the finger at for that kind of situation?
I think what I see is I see political parties playing to their own galleries, and trying to assuage the fears, of their own people. But the way that they're doing that is basically making the other people afraid, making the others, if they're afraid, then we must be doing the right thing. Yeah, and again, and that's what I see at political level. So everybody gets elected as an MLA or an MP to serve all of the constituents in their constituency. But all the parties, not all the parties, but generally, certainly the I see Sinn Féin, and I see the DUP, and I see now the UUP, particularly with Northern Ireland Protocol, not making almost, I was going to say enough of an effort. I'm not making any effort to really support the other side, to be able to kind of have the conversation within their own community and have that shared conversation. In a way that I think I did see with the Good Friday Agreement, I did see a lot more magnanimity around the Good Friday Agreement, in terms of trying to have those broader discussions. and encourage people to see beyond their, I suppose, see beyond their kind of their own kind of world. And part of that, I mean, I remember a lot of discussions around it, and it was about, look, there's enough, there's enough in it to protect both sides, but also meet each other's potential vision. So, I mean, it was a wonderfully worded document. For such a small document, which, as we know, most English MPs never bothered reading, despite the length of it. But I think because it recognised the two communities, it recognised the right to be British and to be Irish. It was very skillfully worded in some of the wording. And I think people keep forgetting that the Good Friday Agreement, because now obviously with the Northern Ireland Protocol, it's been berated again as a problem. The Northern Ireland Protocol, we need, it's one side saying we need rid of it for trade, the other side is saying we have to keep it to protect the Good Friday Agreement, and the other side, we don't want the Good Friday Agreement anymore. So that's kind of, it's become a kind of a pawn in that game. But ultimately, it guarantees that partition will remain until there's enough people in this part of the island that want it otherwise. And yet the work has not been done to convince people who want the status quo to even consider an alternative.
Your line of work now is you're a leadership consultant. You work in the health service, but you're a leadership consultant, and you have a very expansive view of leadership. It's not top-down leadership. It's very much a view that everybody has a role to play in that process. Could you factor that into the political discussion in Northern Ireland and kind of framing it within our theme of partition? I mean, what do ordinary people, if I can use that word ordinary, it sounds like a pejorative term, I don't mean it like that, your average man or woman, you or I, what do we have to contribute to that conversation?
I think the conversation has to be about us. It is us. We have to have the conversation. We have to be magnanimous, in recognizing other people's fears. We have to, if I want one thing and I know someone else is afraid of it, then I'm not going to get it by bullying my way through it, because it still leaves that other person afraid. And then once then that fear turns to anger, and that anger then can go anywhere. So what you really want to do is you want to be able to bring people, with you, so that eventually, if people on this part of the island decide that a shared island, let's not even call it United Ireland, because once United Ireland is such a politically loaded term, that some sort of shared, a genuinely shared island, within a single political framework, that has to be a vision that is sold, and people have to feel that they have a stake in it. And so in terms of leadership, we all have spheres of influence. We can all lead others. Leadership is essentially influencing others, for good or bad. So I think not enough people have the opportunity to have discussions. A lot of people, just see it as a kind of a win or lose. But actually, there has to be some element of compromise. I mean, the petition itself was a compromise. I mean, Cavan probably got left out. Cavan Monaghan Donegal, some would say we had a lucky escape. But I think it was I'm sure Eamonn Malley could tell you exactly what it was. But I think it was about, it was about, really, they weren't really the wealthiest parts. There was kind of like, there wasn't enough there for when it came to partition. So they're happy enough to kind of leave those counties, down as part of the Republic. But yeah, I mean, in terms of leadership, I'd like to see more leadership. I'd like to see a more magnanimous leadership within mainstream political parties, that is seen as that is not a loss. And I think actually, unfortunately, the Assembly, I mean, the Assembly should have created an opportunity, because of the five-party coalition, in terms of an executive. I mean, that should have created an amazing framework and way of working, that people should have been able to develop relationships, look for the common good. Because I know in the committees, the committees, actually all the politicians work really well. The Assembly committees, they work hard, and they work really well. And then you get to the executive, and then you have you kind of, I'm sure there's a lot of really good work gets done, but the media portrays the division as well. And it all plays out. They have the conversation behind closed door, and then it kind of plays out in front of the cameras. People start playing my perception is kind of playing to their own gallery. And and I can see why, because some reason people want to get elected next time round. They've been elected on a particular mandate. They have to protect whatever their mandate is. But I don't see the politicians doing enough to have the conversation at the grassroots level, and to create brave conversations. And looking at, so if you move to kind of getting rid of partition, no matter, whenever it is, if it's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, I think the politicians have to not see it as a win and a loss, because once somebody claims victory, then you're going to have other people who feel very hard done by, and and you could argue that's what happened in the north. The partition happened. Catholics felt very hard done by, and maintained a kind of an armed struggle, and trying to want to change something back. So we've seen it happen, and I wouldn't like to see it again. And I think so. A lot of very, very brave conversations, and a lot of allaying people's concerns, and creating those allaying concerns in a way that's real, because people's concerns are real. People are concerned about losing their British identity. Some people might say, well, sure, how would you lose the British identity if you want a British passport and you have a British passport? But if that's someone's concern, that's someone's genuine belief and concern, then you can't just dismiss it.
Yeah, do you think the kind of shared Ireland that you seem to have in mind, well, the kind you have in mind is obviously, from your point of view, desirable. Is it likely? Is it possible? Do you think we can get to the kind of Ireland that you in your head imagine as being a truly shared Ireland, one in which people are, sensitive to one another's needs and accommodating to maybe the insecurity that people feel?
I don't see it in within 5 or even maybe 10 years, which I know a lot of people say, no, we're pushing for a border poll. I think a border poll is going to alienate people. I think the reason the border poll has been pushed for, to my say, is almost, it's to kind of like, it's again, that's that one-upmanship. It's not about, let's see where things are at. Let's test the lay of the land, with the idea that, because there's been no effort to bring people who are going to vote no.
Yeah, and yet it's in that agreement. It's in that agreement that you praise as much as I do, you think?
Yeah, but there's not the work going on to convince people. So if we have the status quo and we want to change, you have to convince the people who believe in the status quo that change is good, and they can be part of that change. So at the moment you have a group of people who want the status quo and a group of people who don't want the status quo. And it doesn't matter how much the people who don't want the status quo, want to change. It doesn't matter. If you can't convince the other people that change is good, well then, you're wasting your time. And there's not enough effort, I don't think, to convince somebody who believes that they're British, and they want to be made part of the United Kingdom for whatever reason, for political reasons, for educational reasons, for the NHS, for standard of living, whatever that reason is, right? There's nothing been done right now to convince that person that they'd be better in some sort of shared island, political entity, that I can see.
Well, I think there's clearly you're adamant that there's a need for conversations to begin. And I think from the way you're talking, Fidelma, there's a role for all of us to begin that process of conversing with people. And it's probably about reassurance, isn't it, in a way, I suppose?
Well, yeah. Again, it comes back to, if people who want the status quo and you want them to change, then you have to offer them something. They're the people who have to move, and if they've no reason to move, they're thinking, then why would they? There's comfort where you stand. If you hold on to your beliefs. But I think what happens is the politicians are kind of talking about the border poll, and then it's been held up as a big stick. It's been held, and so people people who might even have considered it are kind of thinking, well, no, because actually there's no one in the Ireland, in the Republic, and there's no one in the nationalist parties, or not no one, but certainly not there's not enough rhetoric in the nationalist parties to say that if I change my mind, my identity will be protected. And I don't, there's nobody doing that. And again, in the South, and this is the thing about the presumption that people in the South has great solidarity with the North. I'm not convinced there is. I don't think the work's been done in the south to convince people in the south to take the north back. If you know, it's the conversations aren't being had. We went through the Celtic Tiger. You know, Ireland had a great run of it. It was kind of seen as very much ahead of the north in terms of economy and that kind of thing. It was seen as really cosmopolitan. You know, and I'm not convinced that the South would see getting the 6 counties back as a, you know, your average Southerner, you know, would see it as something that is a bonus. And if they have to pay for it in some way, or if there's any danger, any risk that there'll be any violence as a repercussion, I honestly can't see a lot of people. Not a lot. I can't see that all the people that people presume are going to vote for a United Ireland if there's a border poll. I can't see them doing it. You know, I just can't see it because, again, the conversations haven't been had in the South about why you would want the North back, apart from some maybe historical, you know, kind of like kind of patriotism,
an emotional tug or something like that.
Emotional tug, yeah, that's a good, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of talking to be done then, and a huge job of persuasion to be had. I think if the kind of shared or united Ireland that many people, certainly in the nationalist Republican part of the community, aspire to, for that to happen, and a big job of work to be done to persuade many people in the PUL community that their future lies in some kind of 32 county Ireland.
Yeah.
But look, Fidelma, thanks very much. Maybe in a sense, this series of conversations is, well, the job has begun to an extent. I suppose maybe this will sort of nudge us further down the road of having those kinds of forthright, open, civilized, generous conversations, and contribute something to that whole debate.
I'd like to see that. I really would.
Yeah, and thanks a million for joining us and part of the conversation, and for sharing your view, and a pleasure from my point of view as well. And thanks for being so candid as well in so many ways. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to talk to you. So, Fidelma, thanks very much indeed. And join us again for another in this series of conversations on the line, Perspectives on Partition, with me, Paul McFadden, programme theme developed by the Bloody Sunday Trust.